The crystal chandelier cast a harsh glare over the $80,000 baby shower my parents threw in their own honor. I stood near a towering display of imported white orchids, 7 months pregnant, wearing a restrictive silk maternity dress Diana forced me to put on. Harrison, my father, and a ruthless medical real estate tycoon, tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The room of 150 socialites, hospital board members, and local politicians fell into a hushed silence. He raised his glass toward me, his eyes dead and unyielding. "Let us raise a glass to Claire," he announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted marble walls. The stray dog who finally crawled her way back home once her belly got full and her pockets went empty. A ripple of polite, mocking laughter swept through the ballroom. Diana adjusted her diamond necklace and offered a satisfied smirk. Beside her sat my younger sister, Blair, the golden child of the Kensington family. Blair clapped her hands in a slow, deliberate rhythm, making a spectacle of my public humiliation. Her husband, Marcus, stood directly behind her chair. Marcus is a brilliant African-American corporate attorney who built his reputation defending Fortune 500 companies. Unlike the rest of the room, Marcus did not laugh. He adjusted his watch, his jaw clenched tight, watching me with a tense, unreadable gaze. My nails bit deep into my palms. The insult burned in my chest, but I kept my face entirely blank. I rubbed my pregnant belly and held my ground without shedding a single tear. I am 31 years old, and as a senior healthcare compliance auditor, I spend my life dissecting fraudulent medical records and bringing down corrupt clinics. I knew how to stay quiet while gathering evidence against dangerous people. Harrison took a slow sip of his champagne, basking in the cruel applause of his peers. Then Sarah stepped out from the shadows near the catering entrance. She was the private nurse Harrison hired to monitor my every move and keep me confined to his estate. Sarah walked straight onto the raised dais. She did not hesitate. She leaned in close and whispered a single sentence into my father's ear. I watched the exact second his arrogant world fractured. The blood drained from Harrison's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His hand trembled. The crystal flute slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, sending expensive champagne and jagged glass shards flying across the polished stone. The laughter in the room died instantly. Harrison staggered back, clutching his chest, and sank to his knees right in front of his wealthy guests. He looked up at me with pure, suffocating terror. "My name is Claire." Before I reveal the exact words that brought a billionaire medical mogul to his knees and how I dismantled my own family's toxic empire, drop your city and local time in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe people who use their own flesh and blood as biological pawns always face the consequences. To understand why Harrison crumbled on that stage and how this extravagant baby shower became the site of his public destruction, we have to go back 6 months. We have to go back to the day the trap was set, when I thought my parents were offering me a lifeline, but they were actually preparing a surgical cage. 5 years of silence broke on a rainy Tuesday morning. I stood over the cracked porcelain sink of my cramped studio apartment in the garment district, rinsing the metallic taste of morning sickness from my mouth. An eviction notice rested on the counter. The father of the child growing inside me had packed his bags the moment the pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines. He left a cowardly note next to a stack of final utility bills, claiming he could not handle the pressure of fatherhood. He left me with 3 months of unpaid rent and a maxed-out credit card. I had nothing. A sharp rap at the door shattered the quiet. I opened it to find my father Harrison and my mother Diana standing in the dim hallway. They looked like intruders from another universe. Harrison wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my annual rent. Diana draped a silver mink coat over her shoulders. They did not look at my swollen belly. They looked at the peeling paint on my doorframe with unfiltered disgust. Harrison did not offer a greeting. He stepped inside without an invitation, his polished leather shoes leaving faint wet marks on my scuffed linoleum floor. Diana lingered in the doorway, pressing a scented silk handkerchief to her nose to block the smell of damp mildew and cheap instant noodles. Harrison reached inside his jacket and pulled out a heavy brass keyring and a crisp cashier check. He tossed them onto my rickety dining table. The check was made out for $15,000. The keys bore the insignia of the Elysium Tower, the most secure luxury high-rise in the city. "You carry Kensington blood, Claire." Harrison stated, his voice flat and transactional. His eyes swept over my frayed wool sweater. "Do not embarrass this family by raising a child in a slum. You will move into the penthouse this afternoon. A private car is waiting downstairs." Diana did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I felt or how the baby was doing. She merely glanced at my stomach and adjusted her diamond earrings. "Pack only your identification," she instructed. "Leave this trash behind. We have provided a new wardrobe for you." They turned and walked out before I could utter a single word. I stared at the cashier check. $15,000. It was enough to wipe out my debt, secure my prenatal care, and buy me time to find a new hospital compliance contract. But the Kensington family never gave charity. They executed acquisitions. Every dollar my father spent was an investment, and he always extracted a ruthless return. I touched the cold brass keys. My instincts as a healthcare compliance auditor flared to life. I spent my career hunting down hidden clauses in medical contracts, tracking illicit kickbacks, and identifying structural fraud. My brain processed the data. 5 years of total estrangement. No phone calls on my birthdays. No hospital visits when I had my appendix removed. Now a sudden display of overwhelming financial support right when I entered my 3rd trimester. They did not want to protect me. They wanted the biological asset I was carrying. I had no choice. The landlord was coming on Friday with the sheriff to lock me out. I grabbed my purse, my medical files, and my laptop. I left everything else. The Elysium Tower penthouse sat on the 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the skyline. The furniture consisted of sterile white leather and cold glass. It felt less like a home and more like a high-end quarantine facility. I dropped my bag on the kitchen island and walked back to the front door to check the deadbolt. My hand hovered over the handle. There was no manual thumb turn. Instead, a sleek biometric scanner glowed blue against the steel frame. I recognized the model from secure infectious disease wards. It required a fingerprint scan to enter. I pressed my thumb against the glass reader. The light flashed green and the heavy door clicked open. I stepped out into the hallway, let the door shut, and placed my thumb on the exterior scanner again to re-enter. It worked. Then I noticed the internal panel. A matching biometric scanner was mounted on the inside of the door. My heart skipped a beat. Standard luxury apartments use biometric locks for entry, but they always have manual overrides for exiting in case of emergencies. This door did not. It required a fingerprint scan to leave. I pressed my thumb against the internal scanner. The light blinked red. Access denied. I tried again. The scanner blinked red. I pushed the heavy steel handle. It did not budge. The magnetic strike plate held the door shut with thousands of pounds of force. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. They had not given me a penthouse. They had secured me inside a holding cell. I was physically locked in. Harrison had programmed the system to restrict my exit. I backed away from the door, my breathing shallow and fast. I needed a glass of water. I moved to the kitchen and pulled open the heavy stainless steel refrigerator. There was no normal food inside. No milk, no eggs, no fresh produce. The shelves were lined with rows of identical dark amber glass bottles and prepackaged meal trays bearing clinical barcodes. I picked up one of the bottles. The label bore the logo of Genesis Biolabs. Genesis Biolabs was a private genomic research institute. I knew the name because Harrison controlled the real estate firm that recently purchased the land under their main facility, effectively making him their chief financial backer. I turned the bottle around and read the ingredients. As a compliance auditor, I recognized the chemical compounds. These were not standard prenatal vitamins. They contained high doses of filgrastim and specialized hematopoietic agents. These specific compounds are used in the medical field for one very precise purpose. They stimulate the bone marrow to produce an excess of stem cells flooding the bloodstream and enriching the umbilical cord blood. My hands began to shake. I set the bottle down on the granite counter. The pieces clicked into a terrifying mosaic. Harrison and Diana did not care about my health. They did not care about providing a safe environment for their estranged daughter. They were treating me like a bioreactor. They had locked me inside a controlled environment to pump me full of experimental stem cell boosters. The food trays were strictly measured caloric intake to optimize fetal growth. The two-way lock ensured I could not seek outside medical opinions or run away. I paced the length of the living room, my mind racing through federal healthcare regulations. Prescribing these boosters to a pregnant woman without explicit informed consent violated countless medical ethics laws. But Harrison had insulated himself. The bottles had no prescription labels, no doctor's signature attached. Plausible deniability. If caught, he could claim they were premium dietary supplements. Furthermore, someone had meticulously scratched off the lot numbers on the bottom of the glass, destroying the chain of custody. I walked over to the window and stared down at the traffic crawling 40 stories below. I was trapped. I had no cash on hand, no physical key, and no way to break through a reinforced steel door. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen showed 0 bars of service. Harrison had installed a signal jammer in the walls. The only working communication device was a sleek white landline phone sitting on the coffee table. I picked up the receiver and dialed 911. The line clicked, but it did not route to an emergency dispatcher. A smooth, robotic voice answered, thanking me for calling Kensington Private Security. I hung up immediately. I refused to panic. Panic breeds mistakes. I sat down on the white leather sofa, opened my laptop, and connected to the Penthouse wireless network. It required a login portal managed by Kensington Enterprises. They would monitor every keystroke, every search query, every email sent. I closed the laptop. I was cut off from the outside world. I wrapped my arms around my swollen stomach, feeling a tiny kick against my ribs. I had to play their game. I had to figure out who the stem cells were for. Harrison was a ruthless businessman, but he was not a scientist. He was preparing this biological harvest for a specific client or a specific family member. I spent the night awake on the sofa, staring at the locked door, formulating a strategy to bypass the biometric scanner. I needed to document the amber bottles. I needed to gather physical evidence of the medical coercion. I knew I had to act like the grateful, obedient daughter they expected to see. If they realized I understood the chemistry of those pills, they would escalate their tactics. The silence of the penthouse pressed down on me like a physical weight. The sun began to rise over the city, casting long shadows across the sterile room. I heard the faint electronic chime of the front door scanner engaging from the outside. Someone was overriding the lock. I stood up, bracing myself. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. I expected to see Harrison or Diana bringing my daily orders. But the answer to the mystery of why they needed my unborn child stepped over the threshold, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a secret that would shatter our family forever. The heavy steel door clicked and swung inward, breaking the sterile silence of the penthouse. I braced myself, expecting to see my mother carrying another tray of unlabeled chemical supplements. Instead, my younger sister Blair walked over the threshold. Blair had always been the golden child of the Kensington dynasty. She possessed the kind of effortless privilege that shielded her from every consequence. Yet as she stepped into the harsh morning light of the living room, the illusion of her perfection fractured. She wore a loose cashmere coat that seemed to swallow her frame. Her collarbones jutted sharply against her skin. A pair of oversized Dior sunglasses covered half her face, masking whatever emotion she harbored. Julian Blair's husband followed her inside. A formidable African-American corporate defense attorney, Julian usually commanded the elite legal circles of the city with his sharp intellect and tailored Italian suits. Today, his broad shoulders carried a rigid, uncomfortable tension. He closed the door behind him and locked his gaze on the floor. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. I saw no malice in his expression. I saw only a quiet, strained hesitation, the look of a man cornered into a compromise he deeply despised. Harrison stepped into the room last. My father adjusted his cuffs, his face an impassive mask of authority. He did not offer a greeting. He merely gestured toward the glass dining table, silently ordering us to sit. I did not move. I kept my arms wrapped securely around my swollen stomach. Blair let out a ragged breath and removed her sunglasses. The sight sent a cold shock through my system. The golden child was fading. Deep bruised shadows carved hollows under her eyes. Her skin, usually glowing with expensive spa treatments, carried a sickly, translucent pallor. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the designer frames on the counter. "My bone marrow is failing," Blair stated. Her voice lacked any trace of vulnerability. It held only a brittle, demanding edge. "I have a rare form of aplastic anemia. My body has stopped producing new blood cells. The doctors give me 6 months unless I receive a perfect match stem cell transplant." The heavy brass keyring, the $15,000 check, the biometric locks, the amber glass bottles in the refrigerator. Every puzzle piece slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Harrison and Diana had not rescued me from a looming eviction out of sudden parental guilt. They had hunted me down because my unborn child represented a biological goldmine. They needed the umbilical cord blood. They needed the rich, concentrated stem cells that only a direct genetic relative could provide. I was not a daughter coming home. I was a specialized incubator, harboring the raw materials required to save their preferred child. Blair did not wait for my reaction. She snapped her fingers a sharp, entitled sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Julian stepped forward, his jaw clenched tight. He opened his leather briefcase and extracted a thick stack of legal documents. He placed the papers on the glass table and slid a silver fountain pen next to them. "You need to sign the donation consent forms today," Blair commanded. "We do not have time to waste on your usual stubbornness." I stepped closer to the table, ignoring the pen. My years as a healthcare compliance auditor had trained me to dissect medical contracts, to find the hidden liabilities and the buried risks. I flipped past the cover page. The header bore the logo of Genesis Biolabs. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, hunting for the operational parameters of the procedure. The document was a death trap. "This is not a standard cord blood donation," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "A standard procedure harvests the blood after a natural delivery. It poses no risk to the infant." I tapped my finger against a specific clause on page 3. This clause grants Genesis Biolabs the authority to induce labor at their discretion. I continued reading the legal jargon aloud. It allows them to dictate the timeline of my delivery based on Blair's treatment schedule, regardless of fetal lung development. I turned the page, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The terms grew worse. "You embedded a waiver of liability, releasing the clinical team from any responsibility if the fetus suffers cardiac distress." I looked up, glaring directly at Harrison. "And you slipped in a clause granting yourself full medical power of attorney over me the moment I enter the hospital doors. If I sign this, I surrender all maternal rights to make decisions during the birth. You could order them to cut this child out of me weeks early, just to harvest a higher yield of cells for Blair." Julian shifted his weight. He looked at the window, unable to maintain eye contact with me. As a defense attorney, he knew exactly how predatory the contract was. He knew it violated the fundamental ethics of patient consent. Yet, he remained silent, trapped by the iron grip my father held over his career and his marriage. Blair slammed her frail hand against the glass table. "Do not lecture me about risks, Claire. My life is ending. You owe this family. We put a roof over your head. We paid off your debts. Your child will survive a few weeks in a neonatal intensive care unit. I do not have the luxury of waiting for your ideal birthing plan. Those amber bottles in the refrigerator are filled with experimental bone marrow stimulants." I fired back, my voice slicing through her entitlement. "You are forcing dangerous chemical agents into my bloodstream to enrich the stem cell count before the harvest. You are treating my baby like a pharmaceutical factory. I will not sign a contract that jeopardizes my child's life to fix yours." The air in the penthouse turned lethal. Harrison stepped forward, closing the distance between us. He moved with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to destroying his opposition. He did not yell. He did not need to. His quiet tone carried far more menace than a shout. "I do not raise useless people, Claire." Harrison leveled his gaze at me, his eyes dead and unblinking. "I offered you a chance to serve a purpose. I gave you shelter. I gave you elite medical care. You will repay that investment." I stepped back, putting the kitchen island between us. "I will not sign away my child's safety. You cannot force a medical procedure on me." Harrison offered a smile that chilled the blood in my veins. "You misunderstand your position," he said smoothly. "You are an unemployed single woman facing eviction. The man who impregnated you fled the state. You have $0 in your bank account, a history of financial instability, and no permanent address aside from the one I generously provided." He leaned his palms against the granite counter. "If you refuse to sign that document, I will not simply evict you. I will deploy my legal team to file a preemptive custody petition. I will present the courts with a fabricated psychiatric evaluation detailing your severe prenatal instability. I will paint you as a destitute, delusional risk to your own infant." My breath caught in my throat. He was laying out a blueprint for my total destruction. By the time you give birth, Harrison continued, his voice devoid of any human warmth, I will have a judge declare you unfit. The state will strip that child from your arms the moment they sever the umbilical cord. I will take custody. I will authorize the medical procedures myself. You will walk out of that hospital with nothing, and you will never see your child again. Blair crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk twisting her pale face. Just sign the paper, Claire. Make it easy on yourself. Julian closed his eyes for a brief second. A muscle feathered along his jawline. He recognized the sheer cruelty unfolding in front of him, the weaponization of the legal system he had sworn to uphold. But Harrison owned the firm Julian worked for. Harrison owned the Penthouse. Harrison owned the narrative. You have until the end of the week to accept reality. Harrison decreed. He buttoned his suit jacket, signaling the end of the negotiation. The biometric lock on the front door remains active. You cannot leave. You cannot call for help. Review the paperwork. Consider your future. Harrison turned and walked toward the exit. Blair picked up her Dior sunglasses, sliding them back over her eyes to hide her failing health. She followed our father without a backward glance. Julian lingered for a fraction of a second. He reached out and closed the leather folder holding the toxic contract. He did not speak, but the subtle shake of his head conveyed a silent, desperate message. The threat was real. The heavy steel door clicked shut, the magnetic lock engaging with a sickening thud. I stood alone in the center of the sprawling penthouse, my hands resting protectively over my stomach. The battle lines were drawn. My father had declared war on my unborn child, and he intended to use the full weight of his empire to crush me into submission. The following week descended into a suffocating nightmare. The penthouse transformed from a gilded cage into an active medical black site. I existed in a state of hypervigilance, analyzing every bottle, every tray of food, and every movement beyond the biometric steel door. Harrison did not return personally. He did not need to. He deployed his proxies to tighten the noose. On Thursday morning, the electronic lock chimed. 3 individuals stepped into the living room wearing crisp white lab coats bearing the Genesis Biolabs insignia. They rolled a portable ultrasound machine and a cart loaded with phlebotomy supplies across the hardwood floor. A tall man with thinning gray hair and a clipboard introduced himself as Dr. Vance. He did not offer a comforting smile. He spoke with the clinical detachment of a technician evaluating a piece of machinery. Time for your scheduled prenatal assessment, Claire, Dr. Vance stated, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. Please lie back on the sofa and expose your abdomen. We need to monitor the fetal heart rate and draw your morning labs. I did not trust him. I did not trust any physician on Harrison's payroll. But I knew that open defiance would only provoke them to escalate their tactics. I needed to gather evidence. I needed to understand exactly how far they were willing to go. I moved to the white leather sofa and lay back, lifting the hem of my shirt. Dr. Vance applied the cold gel and pressed the ultrasound transducer against my skin. The rhythmic, rapid thumping of my baby's heartbeat filled the silent room. A fierce, protective instinct flared in my chest. I would not let them harm this child. While Dr. Vance monitored the screen, a female nurse prepped a syringe and a rack of blood collection tubes. Dr. Vance handed me a thick stack of medical intake forms attached to a heavy clipboard. Standard procedure consent forms, Dr. Vance said without looking away from the monitor. Initial the bottom of each page and sign the final sheet. It just authorizes us to process your blood work at the private lab. I took the clipboard. My eyes immediately locked onto the dense blocks of legal text. 5 years spent auditing hospital compliance records had trained my brain to slice through medical jargon. I did not read the large, bold headers. I read the fine print buried in the margins. Page 1 detailed standard blood draws. Page 2 covered the ultrasound. Page 3 appeared to be a routine privacy waiver. But page 4 contained a lethal trap. It was titled, Comprehensive Authorization for Emergency Obstetric Intervention. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I read the clauses with mounting horror. The document did not merely authorize blood work. It explicitly granted Dr. Vance and his surgical team the unilateral right to bypass my consent in the event of fetal distress. It authorized them to administer labor-inducing drugs at their sole discretion. Furthermore, a buried subclause designated Harrison Kensington as my emergency medical proxy, granting him the legal authority to approve a cesarean section if I were deemed incapacitated. They were not planning to wait for a natural birth. They were laying the legal groundwork to cut the baby out of me the moment Blair required the stem cells, regardless of whether my child's lungs had fully developed. I gripped the edge of the clipboard, my knuckles turning white. You tried to slip a comprehensive surgical proxy into a routine blood work consent form, I said, my voice dangerously low. This document authorizes forced labor induction and grants my father medical power of attorney. Dr. Vance paused the ultrasound. He did not look embarrassed. He looked annoyed that his deception had been caught. It is standard precautionary paperwork for high-risk pregnancies. Dr. Vance replied, his tone dismissive. Given your history of stress and your isolated living situation, we must ensure all emergency protocols are legally established. Sign the document, Claire. I pulled a pen from my pocket. I did not sign the signature line. Instead, I drew a massive, jagged X across the entire page, striking out the lethal clauses. I wrote consent denied in bold letters across the top and handed the clipboard back to him. I will not authorize my father to make surgical decisions regarding my body, I stated, staring directly into his cold eyes. And I will not grant you the right to induce labor for Genesis Biolab's convenience. Dr. Vance stared at the ruined document. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He handed the clipboard to the nurse and picked up a specialized syringe from the medical cart. The liquid inside was a thick, viscous yellow. You are making this unnecessarily difficult, Dr. Vance muttered. He grabbed my arm with unexpected force, his grip bruising my skin. The nurse moved quickly, securing a tourniquet above my bicep. What is that? I demanded, trying to pull my arm away. The contract was denied. You do not have consent to inject me with anything. It is a high-dose prenatal vitamin complex to counteract your evident nutritional deficiencies, Dr. Vance said, ignoring my resistance. The needle pierced my vein before I could struggle free. He depressed the plunger, forcing the thick yellow liquid into my bloodstream. I shoved him backward and ripped the needle out, a drop of blood spilling onto the pristine white leather sofa. Get out! I yelled, my voice echoing off the glass windows. Leave this apartment immediately before I call the police for medical assault. Dr. Vance calmly disposed of the syringe in a biohazard container. He packed up the ultrasound machine with unhurried precision. We will return tomorrow, Claire. I suggest you reconsider your obstructive attitude. Your father's patience is not infinite. The medical team exited the penthouse, the biometric lock sealing them out. I stood alone in the living room, my chest heaving. The adrenaline masked the initial effects of the injection, but within 3 minutes, the chemical reality hit me. My vision blurred at the edges. A wave of intense, nauseating dizziness washed over me, forcing me to grip the granite kitchen counter to stay upright. My heart rate skyrocketed, hammering against my sternum in a frantic, irregular rhythm. A cold sweat broke out across my body. The room began to spin. This was not a vitamin complex. They had injected me with a heavy chemical sedative, likely a fast-acting synthetic tranquilizer designed to suppress my central nervous system. They were using pharmacology to terrorize me, punishing me for refusing to sign the surgical proxy. They wanted to demonstrate that my defiance would result in physical suffering. I stumbled toward the white landline phone on the coffee table. My legs felt like lead. The room tilted violently. I grabbed the receiver and dialed 911. My fingers fumbled over the large buttons. The line clicked. The same smooth, robotic voice answered. Thank you for calling Kensington Private Security. Please hold for an operator. I slammed the receiver down. Harrison had completely isolated the physical line. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. The screen still showed 0 bars. The signal jammer hidden in the penthouse walls was blocking all cellular frequencies. I collapsed onto the floor, my vision darkening. The chemical sedative dragged me down into a terrifying, suffocating fog. I lay on the cold hardwood, feeling the rapid, panicked kicks of my baby responding to the sudden spike in my heart rate. Harrison and Diana had not just provided a penthouse. They had built a high-tech biological prison. They controlled the locks. They controlled the communications. They controlled the medical team injecting experimental chemicals into my veins. I was a hostage in a multi-million-dollar cell, held captive by the very people who were supposed to protect me. As the darkness finally overtook my consciousness, a single crystal-clear realization burned in my mind. If I did not find a way to break their absolute control, I would not survive the delivery, and my child would become nothing more than harvest material for Blair. I had to stop acting like a victim and start operating like an auditor inside a hostile system. I needed to find a vulnerability, and I needed to exploit it before the next medical team arrived. I woke up on the cold hardwood floor with a splitting headache. The chemical sedative Dr. Vance pumped into my veins had finally worn off, leaving behind a lingering nausea and a sharp ache in my joints. I dragged myself up using the edge of the glass coffee table, my muscles stiff and uncooperative. My stomach growled a hollow, painful reminder that I had not eaten a real meal since yesterday morning. I walked into the kitchen and opened the stainless steel refrigerator. The shelves held nothing but the amber glass bottles of bone marrow stimulants and 2 empty ceramic trays. I grabbed my laptop. If the physical door was locked, I would navigate through the digital world. I opened a grocery delivery application, desperate to secure basic sustenance. I added Apple's bread and bottled water to the cart, then clicked the checkout button. The screen loaded for 5 seconds. A gray notification box popped up. Payment declined. I frowned and switched to my banking portal. The login screen flashed a stark red warning banner across the top. Account frozen. Please contact your branch administrator regarding suspicious activity. I tried my secondary checking account, my meager emergency savings, and even my high-interest credit card. Every single financial avenue displayed a 0 available balance or a locked status. Harrison had not just locked me in a room, he had severed my financial arteries. He leveraged his elite banking connections to freeze my assets, likely classifying my accounts under a fabricated fraud investigation flag to stall any transactions. I was broke, pregnant, and trapped in a sky-high glass cage. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the gray street 40 stories below. A heavy industrial tow truck was backing up to the curb outside the tower entrance. My chest tightened. My 10-year-old sedan, the only piece of property I truly owned, was hitched to the steel cables. Standing on the sidewalk holding a designer umbrella against the morning drizzle was my mother. Diana directed the tow operator with brief, sharp gestures of her gloved hand. She had reported my vehicle as abandoned or illegally parked in a private zone. She did not look up at the tower. She simply watched my only means of escape get dragged away down the asphalt, then climbed into the back of her waiting black town car. I turned away from the window and marched to the front door. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner, hoping the system reset overnight. The panel beeped. A sharp red error code crawled across the digital display. System locked down. Biometric credentials revoked. I hit the panel with the base of my palm. I threw my shoulder against the reinforced steel. The heavy door absorbed the impact without a single rattle. The metal felt cold and indifferent. Harrison had deactivated my thumbprint from a remote server. The siege had officially begun. They intended to starve me out until I submitted to their medical demands. The next 24 hours tested every physical limit of my body. The hunger twisted into sharp, relentless cramps. My baby kicked frantically against my ribs, reacting to the sudden drop in blood sugar. I drank tap water from the kitchen sink to trick my stomach, pacing the length of the living room to keep my circulation flowing. The silence of the penthouse stretched into a suffocating pressure. They wanted me weak. They wanted me exhausted. They wanted my unwavering compliance. But Harrison and Diana made one critical miscalculation. They assumed a pregnant woman in a hostile environment would paralyze herself with fear. They forgot my professional background. As a healthcare compliance auditor, I spent years tracking digital footprints left by corrupt hospital administrators. I knew how to navigate restricted networks. 2 days prior, during the first 15 minutes, I arrived at the penthouse before Harrison activated the cellular signal jammer, hidden inside the walls. I noticed a vulnerability. The smart refrigerator in the kitchen featured an unsecured diagnostic port on the back panel, operating on a separate hardwired building maintenance network. I had connected my laptop, accessed the building intranet, and coded a dead man switch script. I scheduled an encrypted email to send itself automatically if I did not manually delay the timer every 12 hours. When Dr. Vance injected me and the signal jammer went active, I missed the check-in window. The script executed precisely as programmed. It compiled the digital photographs I took of the unlabeled amber bottles, the serial numbers on the clinical food trays, and a detailed incident report regarding the illegal biometric lock mechanism. It sent the entire encrypted package directly to the secure inbox of my former supervisor at the Federal Medical Compliance Board. A silent alarm was already ringing in Washington. Federal agents were reviewing the data. I just needed to buy time for them to secure a warrant and build their case. By the second afternoon, my vision blurred from the lack of calories. My hands shook as I gripped the granite counter to stabilize myself. I knew I had to play the role my parents scripted for me. I needed to feed their ego, to lower their defenses. I dragged myself to the coffee table and picked up the white landline receiver. The automated Kensington private security voice answered. "Connect me to Diana Kensington," I said, keeping my voice faint and raspy. The line clicked. 30 seconds later, my mother answered the call. She did not say hello. She did not ask about my well-being. "Are you ready to behave?" Claire Diana asked. Her voice held the crisp, unyielding tone of a woman negotiating a hostile corporate takeover. I forced a dry sob into the back of my throat, acting the part of a broken victim. "I am hungry," I whispered into the receiver. "The door will not open." Diana sighed, a soft sound of theatrical disappointment. "The door opens when you sign the medical proxy transferring surgical rights to your father. It is a very simple transaction. You brought this isolation upon yourself through your stubborn defiance. You took my car," I said, letting a tremor bleed into my words. "My bank accounts are frozen. I have nothing left. You have no money, no vehicle, and no exit," Diana stated, laying out the stark reality of their trap with clinical precision. "You are a destitute single mother trapped in an apartment you do not own. If you try to fight us in a courtroom, what judge would grant you custody? Harrison will have Child Protective Services declare you unfit before you even reach the recovery room. Sign the papers, Claire, and we will turn the locks back on. We will bring you a hot meal. We will let you rest." I squeezed my eyes shut, channeling every ounce of genuine physical exhaustion into my performance. I let out a loud, broken cry. I let the phone slip slightly from my grip so the receiver rubbed against my cheek, making my distress sound amplified and desperate. "Please," I begged, forcing my voice to crack and waver. "Please just open the door. I cannot fight you anymore. The baby needs food. I will do whatever you want." I heard the distinct sound of ice clinking against a crystal glass on her end of the line. Diana was drinking a cocktail in her mansion while she starved her pregnant daughter into submission. "Excellent," Diana purred, victorious. "We are hosting a family dinner this Sunday. It will serve as a lovely precursor to your baby shower next week. You will attend the dinner. You will smile. You will sign the medical proxy in front of our private notary. If you do that, you get your life back. I will sign it." I cried into the receiver. "I promise. Just turn the lock off." The line went dead. 10 seconds later, the heavy steel door clicked. The magnetic strike plate released its iron grip. The biometric lock glowed green. I hung up the phone. The tears vanished from my face instantly. I stood up, bracing my hands on the coffee table, a cold, predatory calm washing over my starved body. My parents believed they had broken me. They believed their financial leash and physical isolation had crushed my will to resist. They did not know they had just handed me the keys to the largest public stage of their lives. I would attend their lavish dinner. I would smile for their guests. I would play the broken stray dog they wanted to see. And I would set the final lethal pieces of my trap, counting down the hours until the federal agents arrived to tear their empire down to the foundation. The Sunday family dinner served as a masterclass in psychological warfare. Harrison hosted the event at his private estate in the Hamptons, a sprawling compound surrounded by manicured hedges and wrought iron gates. The dining room dripped in wealth. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the long mahogany table. Silver cutlery gleamed beside bone china plates. Yet the air felt suffocating heavy with the unsaid threats hanging over my head. Harrison sat at the head of the table nursing a glass of scotch. He used every opportunity to humiliate me in front of the 10 elite guests. He brought up my frozen bank accounts, framing them as a tragic consequence of my financial incompetence. He pointed out my plain maternity dress, a stark contrast to Blair's designer gown, implying I lacked the refinement required for high society. "Look at Claire," Harrison sneered, gesturing toward me with his glass. "We rescued her from a squalid studio apartment. We offered her a penthouse, and she repays our generosity with hysterical paranoia. Pregnancy has truly compromised her mental faculties." The guests murmured in polite, detached sympathy. Diana sighed and patted my hand with a cold, performative touch. She signaled a waiter who immediately placed a silver tray in front of me. On the tray sat a small amber glass bottle and a glass of water. "Time for your specialized vitamins, Claire." Diana said, her voice carrying a sickeningly sweet tone meant for the audience. "We must ensure the baby receives proper nutrition, considering your severe dietary neglect." My heart pounded against my ribs. It was the same chemical sedative Dr. Vance had injected into my veins. They were using the dinner party as a stage to force my compliance. If I refused the medication in front of the guests, Harrison would use the outburst as further evidence of my erratic behavior. If I drank it, I would succumb to the paralyzing fog, unable to defend myself during the rest of the evening. I picked up the amber bottle, keeping my hands steady. I uncapped it and raised it to my lips. I let the bitter liquid hit my tongue, but I did not swallow. I quickly chased it with a large gulp of water, secretly spitting the sedative back into the opaque drinking glass while pretending to clear my throat with a linen napkin. I set the water glass down, adopting a dull, compliant expression. "Excellent," Harrison noted, satisfied with my apparent submission. He turned his attention back to a hedge fund manager seated to his right, launching into a discussion about real estate acquisitions. The dinner stretched into a grueling ordeal. I maintained the facade of a broken, sedated daughter, nodding slowly and avoiding eye contact. Across the table, Julian, my brother-in-law, remained unusually quiet. The sharp, aggressive corporate defense attorney usually dominated dinner conversations with legal anecdotes. Tonight he focused intensely on his plate, cutting his steak with precise, rigid movements. His jaw clenched every time Harrison directed a cruel remark my way. After dessert, the guests relocated to the drawing room for cigars and cognac. I excused myself, claiming the pregnancy made me fatigued. I walked toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the terrace, desperate for cold, fresh air. As I stepped onto the stone patio, a shadow detached itself from the brick wall. Julian stood near the stone balustrade, the orange glow of a lit cigarette illuminating the tense lines of his face. He checked over his shoulder, ensuring the glass doors remained shut and the drawing room was out of earshot. Julian approached me, his movements quick and decisive. He dropped the cigarette onto the stone tiles and crushed it under his leather shoe. He did not offer his usual confident legal smirk. His dark eyes held a frantic, desperate intensity. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire," Julian whispered, his voice a low, vibrating baritone. "We have less than 2 minutes before Harrison notices I stepped outside. You need to run. You need to pack whatever you can carry and disappear tonight." I stared at him, my compliance auditor instincts flaring. Julian was Harrison's legal fixer. He drafted the predatory medical contracts. He shielded the Kensington Empire from liability. He was the last person on earth I expected to offer a warning. Run where I asked, keeping my tone guarded. Harrison froze my accounts. He took my car. He locked me in a penthouse. Julian pulled a thick, unmarked manila envelope from his inner jacket pocket and shoved it into my hands. "I know about the financial freeze. I know about the biometric locks," he said rapidly. "There are $10,000 in untraceable cash inside that envelope, along with a burner phone and a prepaid bus ticket to Chicago. Do not go back to the penthouse. Do not go back to your old apartment." I gripped the envelope, the weight of the cash pressing against my palms. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, searching his face for a trap. "You wrote the surgical proxy. You watched them inject me." Julian ran a hand over his short, close-cropped hair. A bitter, self-loathing laugh escaped his lips. "Because I draft contracts, Claire. I negotiate corporate mergers. I do not facilitate biological theft." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Harrison is not planning to wait for your compliance. He finalized a secondary strategy this afternoon. He paid off a private psychiatric board operating out of a clinic he funds. They forged a comprehensive evaluation diagnosing you with severe prenatal delusional disorder." The cold evening wind sliced through my dress, but the chill spreading through my veins had nothing to do with the weather. "If you do not sign that medical proxy voluntarily at the baby shower next week," Julian continued, the words tumbling out in a rushed, terrified cadence, "Harrison will trigger the psychiatric hold. The moment your water breaks, an involuntary transport team will seize you. They will lock you in a secured ward under heavily sedated protocols. You will be declared legally incompetent. Harrison will assume full guardianship. They will induce labor harvest the cord blood for Blair, and you will wake up in a padded room with 0 parental rights." I felt the blood drain from my face. My father was orchestrating a legal and medical kidnapping. He intended to strip me of my humanity, reducing me to a biological vessel owned by the state and controlled by his wealth. I looked at Julian, the formidable attorney reduced to a panicked whistleblower. "Why are you risking your career to tell me this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Harrison will destroy you if he finds out." Julian looked away, staring out over the dark expanse of the manicured lawn. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his complicity bearing down on him. "Because Harrison threatened to revoke my partnership track if I did not draft the psychiatric paperwork." Julian admitted, the shame evident in his tone. "I spent 5 years building my reputation at that firm. I thought I could swallow my morals for a corner office." He turned back to face me, his eyes bright with unshed emotion. "But I watched him humiliate you tonight. I watched him force that chemical down your throat." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to my swollen stomach. "The child you are carrying deserves the right to exist as a human being, Claire. It does not deserve to be born as a medical supply mine for a family that views us all as disposable assets." Julian checked his watch, a sharp curse escaping his lips. "I have to go back inside. Do not wait for the baby shower. Take the envelope. Leave through the service gates. I disabled the camera on the east perimeter. Go." Julian spun around and walked quickly back toward the glass doors, re-entering the warm, opulent drawing room to resume his role as the loyal son-in-law. I stood alone on the cold terrace, clutching the manila envelope. $10,000 in cash offered an immediate escape. I could run. I could board the bus, disappear into a new city, and raise my child in anonymity. It was the safest, most logical option. But I looked back through the glass doors. I saw Harrison laughing, raising his glass of scotch, completely secure in his absolute power. I saw Diana adjusting her diamonds, entirely unbothered by the monstrous cruelty she enabled. I saw Blair sitting on the plush sofa, her pale face illuminated by the fire, waiting to consume my child's biology to save her own life. If I ran, Harrison would face no consequences. He would simply hunt me down with private investigators. He would use his wealth to silence the psychiatric board. He would continue to operate his empire with absolute impunity. I was a healthcare compliance auditor. I did not run from corrupt systems. I dismantled them from the inside. I opened the manila envelope, removed the burner phone, and tucked the $10,000 into my clutch. I walked back toward the glass doors, my posture straight, my resolve hardened into solid steel. I would not flee to Chicago. I would attend the baby shower. I would walk directly into the center of Harrison's elaborate trap, and I would bring the entire Kensington dynasty crashing down upon their own heads. The morning after Julian delivered his warning on the terrace, the Kensington machinery shifted into high gear. I had barely finished brushing my teeth when the heavy steel door of the penthouse chimed. The biometric lock disengaged. I expected the daily delivery of clinical food trays. Instead, the door flew open, and chaos flooded into the living room. Diana stormed across the threshold, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not wear her usual composed, aristocratic expression. Her hair appeared slightly disheveled. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Following close behind her were 2 large, imposing men wearing crisp, white clinical coats over dark slacks. They did not carry medical charts or ultrasound equipment. They carried heavy leather restraints and a stainless steel medical kit. I recognized the tactical formation immediately. This was an extraction team. Harrison was not waiting for the baby shower to execute his psychiatric trap. He was initiating the involuntary hold right now. Claire Diana shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, theatrical wail that echoed off the glass windows. "Claire, please calm down. You are not in your right mind." I stood frozen near the kitchen island, completely bewildered by her performance. I had not spoken a single word. I had not made a single aggressive movement. Yet Diana threw her designer handbag onto the floor, deliberately knocking over a tall glass vase resting on the console table. The vase shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. Diana did not stop there. She grabbed the edge of the granite counter and intentionally scraped her own forearm against a sharp, exposed corner of a decorative metal bowl. A thin line of blood welled up on her pale skin. "Help me!" Diana screamed, turning toward the 2 men in the white coats. She grabbed a steak knife from the wooden butcher block on the counter and threw it clattering across the floor, making it look as though I had dropped a weapon. She is completely delusional. She just tried to attack me. She is a danger to herself and the baby." The two clinical men moved into action with practiced efficiency. The larger of the two stepped forward, pulling a heavy syringe from his pocket and removing the plastic cap with his teeth. The needle gleamed under the recessed lighting. "Miss Kensington, please step away from the kitchen area." The man said, his tone devoid of any medical empathy. It was the voice of a bouncer, not a doctor. "We are authorized by the private psychiatric board to execute an involuntary 48-hour evaluation hold. We need to administer a mild sedative for your own safety and transport you to the facility." The cold reality of the trap closed around my throat. Harrison had engineered a flawless legal ambush. If I screamed, if I fought back, or if I tried to run toward the door, my actions would provide the exact physical evidence these men needed to justify the sedative and the straitjacket. A pregnant woman resisting medical personnel after allegedly assaulting her mother would look undeniably psychotic on a police report. Once they dragged me out of this penthouse and locked me in Harrison's funded psychiatric ward, I would lose all legal autonomy. They would drug me into a stupor-induced labor, harvest the cord blood for Blair, and sign the infant over to my father's custody before I ever regained consciousness. Panic threatened to overwhelm my rational thought process. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. The man with the syringe took another step forward, his eyes locked onto my upper arm, calculating the injection site. I forced myself to draw a slow, deep breath. I was a healthcare compliance auditor. I spent my professional life dismantling complex fraud schemes by analyzing the structural weaknesses of corrupt organizations. I did not rely on emotion. I relied on data documentation and leverage. I did not scream. I did not raise my hands in defense. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, letting an eerie, unnatural calm settle over my features. I looked past the two men with the restraints. I looked directly into Diana's eyes. Her theatrical tears vanished for a split second, replaced by a flicker of confusion at my lack of resistance. "You forgot my profession, Mother," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden silence of the room. It was not a question. It was a declaration of war. I slowly raised my right hand and pointed a single finger toward the ceiling, aiming directly at the circular plastic smoke detector mounted above the kitchen island. Did Harrison really believe a federal compliance auditor would inhabit a hostile environment for a week without establishing a surveillance perimeter? I asked, keeping my tone deadly flat. The man with the syringe paused. He glanced up at the ceiling fixture. "That smoke detector does not contain a carbon monoxide sensor." I lied, projecting absolute, unshakable confidence. "It houses a wide-angle, high-definition camera equipped with an active cellular uplink operating on an independent frequency that bypasses the jammer in the walls." Diana froze. The fabricated scratch on her arm continued to bleed, dripping onto the pristine hardwood floor, but she no longer seemed to notice the pain. For the past 3 minutes, I continued enunciating every syllable with ruthless precision. "That camera has recorded you entering the apartment unprovoked. It recorded you deliberately smashing the vase. It recorded you self-inflicting a wound on your arm, and it recorded you tossing a knife across the floor to stage an assault." The second man, the one holding the leather restraints, took a step backward. His eyes darted nervously between me and the ceiling fixture. "Furthermore," I said, locking my gaze on the man holding the needle, "the footage is currently streaming live to an encrypted cloud server managed by my legal counsel. If that syringe pierces my skin, if you attempt to remove me from this property against my will, the video file will automatically route to the Federal Bureau of Investigation under a priority flag for medical kidnapping, aggravated assault, and falsification of psychiatric records." The silence in the penthouse turned suffocating. The bluff was a massive gamble. The smoke detector was just a smoke detector. I had no camera. I had no live uplink. But Diana and these hired thugs did not know that. They only knew that my father was dealing with an auditor who had a history of exposing corporate fraud. They could not risk the possibility that a federal agency was currently watching them attempt to kidnap a pregnant woman. The man with the syringe slowly lowered his hand. He capped the needle and shoved it back into his pocket. He looked at Diana, his expression hardening into angry resentment. "You did not mention she had the room wired for surveillance, Mrs. Kensington," he muttered. We are not facing federal charges for a private extraction job." He turned on his heel and walked toward the open front door. His partner dropped the leather restraints onto the sofa and followed him without a word. They were mercenaries paid to execute a clean snatch and grab. They were not paid to engage in a high-stakes legal standoff with the FBI. Diana stood alone in the center of the ruined living room. The shattered glass crunched under her designer shoes. The carefully constructed narrative of the hysterical daughter had collapsed in seconds. Her face cycled through shock, humiliation, and finally a deep, venomous rage. She did not bother maintaining the frantic mother persona. She glared at me, her eyes burning with raw hatred. "You are a cunning, ungrateful little stray." She spat the insult, dripping with aristocratic disdain. I did not flinch. I crossed my arms over my chest. "I suggest you clean up the glass before you leave," I replied smoothly. "It presents a safety hazard." Diana turned sharply and marched out of the penthouse. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, the biometric lock engaging with a solid, definitive thud. I remained rooted to the spot for a full minute, ensuring they were not waiting in the hallway. Once I was certain the immediate threat had passed, my knees buckled. I collapsed against the kitchen counter, my entire body shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline crashed out of my system. I had survived the ambush by a hair's breadth. 10 minutes later, the burner phone Julian had smuggled to me vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text message glowed on the small screen. The sender was an unknown number, but I recognized the cadence of the threat instantly. "You think a cheap bluff changes the outcome." The message read, "You cannot hide forever. Next week is the baby shower. The press will be there. The board members will be there. You will stand on that stage. You will sign the surgical proxy in front of the cameras, smiling like a grateful daughter. If you refuse, I will not bother with a psychiatric ward. I will ensure you lose everything and you will never see the child again. Be ready." I stared at the glowing text. Harrison was not retreating. The failed psychiatric setup had only enraged him. I was accelerating the timeline, moving the battlefield from the isolated penthouse to a public arena where he held all the social and financial leverage. He intended to force my compliance through sheer public humiliation and the threat of total destruction. I deleted the message and snapped the burner phone shut. My father wanted a public spectacle. He wanted an audience to witness my submission. He was about to get exactly what he asked for, but the ending would follow a script he never could have anticipated. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, stood up straight, and began to assemble the pieces for the final devastating counterstrike. Following the failed psychiatric ambush, Harrison did not leave my captivity to chance. He recognized that the biometric lock and the jammed cellular signals were insufficient to guarantee my submission. To ensure absolute compliance before the highly publicized baby shower, he deployed a human warden. Her name was Sarah, a private registered nurse contracted at an exorbitant daily rate, tasked with monitoring my vitals, administering the chemical injections, and reporting my every movement directly to my father. Sarah arrived the next morning. She wore immaculate dark blue scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun. She moved with a stiff professional efficiency, setting up a blood pressure cuff and organizing a tray of syringes on the glass coffee table without making eye contact. Harrison had undoubtedly vetted her, thoroughly selecting someone he believed would prioritize a massive paycheck over medical ethics. He made one catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot to check her employment history beyond her current private contracting agency. I recognized the slight hesitation in Sarah's hands when she prepped the first syringe of the bone marrow stimulant. The sharp, jerky motion betrayed a deep internal conflict. An auditor notices these micro-expressions. I watched her for 2 days, cataloging her behavior. She strictly followed Harrison's schedule, logging my caloric intake and taking my blood pressure, but she never forced conversation. She never offered the condescending fake sympathy my mother employed. She operated like a ghost, haunting the penthouse. On the third afternoon, while Sarah strapped the blood pressure cuff to my upper arm, I decided to test the waters. "I know these are not prenatal vitamins," I said softly, staring directly at the amber bottle resting on the tray. "I know they are high-dose hematopoietic agents designed to force my bone marrow to overproduce stem cells. I also know that administering them without informed consent is a federal crime." Sarah froze. The Velcro of the blood pressure cuff ripped loudly in the quiet room as her hand slipped. She looked up, her eyes wide, realizing I was not the naive, terrified pregnant woman Harrison had described. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "You are risking your nursing license to assist a billionaire in harvesting biological material from his estranged daughter. Harrison Kensington will not protect you when the federal investigators arrive. He will claim you acted independently. He will throw you under the bus to save his own empire." Sarah stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The professional mask cracked, revealing a profound, simmering anger beneath the surface. She did not defend Harrison. She did not deny the nature of the drugs. Instead, she unhooked the blood pressure cuff and tossed it onto the sofa. She picked up the prepared syringe, walked over to the kitchen sink, and discharged the thick yellow liquid down the drain. She rinsed the needle, disposed of it in the sharps container, and returned to the coffee table. "I know exactly how Harrison Kensington treats his employees." Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. 4 years ago, he executed a hostile takeover of the community clinic network in the South Ward. He liquidated the pension fund, slashed the operating budget, and fired 40% of the nursing staff to inflate the profit margins before reselling the properties. My mother was one of those nurses. She lost her health insurance right before her cancer diagnosis. We lost our home trying to pay her medical bills. The air in the penthouse shifted. The tension did not evaporate, but it transformed from adversarial hostility into a volatile shared understanding. We were two women trapped in the orbit of a man who viewed human lives as disposable line items on a balance sheet. I took this contract because the daily rate covers my mother's outstanding medical debt. Sarah continued, her eyes dropping to the floor. I despise the man, but I needed the money. However, pumping experimental drugs into a pregnant woman crosses a line I cannot justify regardless of the paycheck. I reached out and touched her arm. "We can destroy him." I said the words sharp and absolute. "We can dismantle the entire Kensington empire, but I need your help. I need evidence that bypasses his corrupted medical network." Sarah looked at me, a spark of dangerous defiance lighting up her eyes. "I have access to the primary Genesis Biolabs database through the security credentials Harrison provided for this assignment." She admitted, glancing nervously toward the front door. "I reviewed Blair's preliminary transplant workup last night to understand the dosage requirements for these stimulants." She leaned in closer, the air between us crackling with electric tension. "Something is wrong with the file, Claire. The human leukocyte antigen typing does not align properly." My heart skipped a beat. HLA typing is the critical genetic marker used to match stem cell donors with recipients. The closer the match, the higher the chance the transplant will succeed, without the recipient's body rejecting the new cells. Siblings usually have a 25% chance of being a perfect match. "What do you mean it does not align?" I asked, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pulled a small encrypted tablet from her scrub pocket and opened a secured medical file. "According to the preliminary blood work Genesis Biolabs conducted on you last week, your HLA markers indicate a standard biological relationship with Harrison and Diana. However, I cross-referenced the markers on Blair's chart. The haplotype sequences are completely skewed." She pointed to a dense column of genetic data on the screen. "Unless there was a catastrophic error during the sequencing, it is genetically impossible for Blair to share both parents with you. The markers strongly suggest she only shares one biological parent." The implication hit me like a physical blow. Blair was not a full sibling. My mother had carried her, which meant Diana was the biological mother. But Harrison's genetic markers were absent from Blair's profile. Diana had engaged in an affair 28 years ago. Blair, the golden child, the perfect Kensington heir, did not carry a single drop of Kensington blood. The medical ramifications were staggering. Because Blair was only a half-sibling, the chance of my unborn child providing a compatible stem cell match plummeted drastically. The umbilical cord blood Harrison was so desperate to harvest would be virtually useless for Blair's transplant. Harrison is committing federal crimes to harvest cord blood that will not even save her. I whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. "Does he know?" Sarah shook her head. "No. Genesis Biolabs has not completed the final cross-match analysis. They are operating under the assumption that you are full sisters because Diana listed Harrison as the father on the medical intake forms. They are rushing the biological harvest before finalizing the genetic compatibility because Blair's condition is deteriorating rapidly. A cold, ruthless clarity settled over me. This was the nuclear weapon I needed. A fabricated psychiatric hold could be fought in court. Financial strangulation could be survived. But a fundamental biological lie that unraveled a 30-year marriage and destroyed the medical justification for the entire kidnapping scheme that would shatter the Kensington dynasty permanently. We cannot rely on Genesis Biolabs to process the final match. I said, my mind racing through the logistics. Harrison owns the facility. The moment his technicians realize the discrepancy, he will order them to bury the data to avoid a scandal. Or worse, he will force the transplant anyway out of sheer denial. We need undeniable third-party proof. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. I can secure the samples. I have full access to Harrison's personal grooming suite when he visits the penthouse to check on the security feed. I can extract a hair follicle with the root intact. I can draw a fresh vial of your blood right now. But getting Blair's sample will be difficult. Blair left her Dior sunglasses on the kitchen counter when she visited last week. I replied, pointing toward the marble island. She was sweating. The frames are likely covered in epithelial cells. Can a lab extract DNA from that? Sarah grabbed a sterile evidence swab from her medical kit. Easily. We moved with frantic, silent precision. Sarah swabbed the designer sunglasses, sealing the sample in a plastic vial. She drew a small amount of my blood, labeling it with a randomized alphanumeric code instead of my name to ensure anonymity. The next afternoon, during Harrison's brief, intimidating inspection of my captivity, Sarah successfully acquired a hair sample from his overcoat. I handed Sarah an envelope containing $2,000 from the cash Julian had smuggled to me. Take this to an independent out-of-state genomics laboratory. I instructed her. Pay for expedited processing. Do not use your real name. Use a burner email for the results. Sarah tucked the envelope into her scrubs and placed the biological samples in a temperature-controlled lockbox hidden inside her medical supply bag. I will have the results in 48 hours, she promised. The secret alliance was forged. We were no longer a captive daughter and a hired warden. We were saboteurs, operating inside the belly of the beast. Harrison continued to send threatening text messages to my burner phone, promising utter ruin if I did not smile and sign the surgical proxy at the upcoming baby shower. I read his threats and smiled. My father was meticulously constructing a grand public stage to showcase his power and force my submission. He invited the press. He invited the hospital board members. He invited the political elite. He wanted an audience. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the city lights flicker to life against the darkening sky. Harrison was about to get exactly what he wanted, a massive public spectacle. But I held the biological detonator, and I fully intended to burn his entire empire to ash in front of every single guest. 3 days before the baby shower, Harrison decided to test the limits of his control. He orchestrated a calculated release from the penthouse, a brief excursion into the public sphere to demonstrate that my compliance was not merely physical, but psychological. Sarah received the orders via an encrypted message. She was to escort me to a high-end coffee shop in the financial district for exactly 45 minutes. The outing was not an act of mercy. It was a tactical maneuver designed to ambush me in a public setting where screaming or resisting would only validate the fabricated narrative of my mental instability. I stepped out of the luxury town car, the cold city air biting through my thin maternity coat. Sarah walked close beside me, maintaining the appearance of a dedicated private nurse. We entered the bustling cafe, the scent of roasted espresso beans mixing with the sharp tang of impending conflict. I did not have to wait long. I had barely taken a seat at a corner table when 3 men in tailored suits approached. They moved with the synchronized, aggressive fluidity of corporate predators. The man in the center, a senior partner at Harrison's retained law firm, did not bother with pleasantries. He carried a heavy leather briefcase, which he dropped onto the small marble table with a loud, intimidating thud. The surrounding patrons glanced over their curiosity, piqued by the sudden disruption, but quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to involve themselves in a wealthy family's dispute. "Good morning, Claire." The lead attorney stated, his voice a low, vibrating growl designed to project authority without causing a public scene. He unlatched the briefcase and pulled out 2 thick manila folders, placing them squarely in front of me. "Your father has grown tired of your prolonged hesitation." He continued tapping a manicured finger against the first folder. "We are concluding this negotiation today." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "Negotiation implies a mutual exchange of terms," I replied, maintaining a steady, even tone. "This feels more like an ultimatum." The attorney offered a cold, predatory smile. "Call it whatever you prefer. The reality remains unchanged." He opened the first folder, revealing the comprehensive authorization for emergency obstetric intervention, the surgical proxy I had previously refused to sign. He then opened the second folder. This document was far more dangerous. The header displayed the official seal of a prominent private psychiatric board. The pages were filled with dense medical terminology detailing a severe, escalating case of prenatal delusional disorder. It outlined a pattern of erratic behavior, paranoia, and a documented refusal to adhere to necessary medical protocols. The final page bore the signatures of 3 licensed psychiatrists, alongside a glaring red stamp authorizing an immediate involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold pending long-term institutionalization. "This evaluation is entirely fabricated," I said, my voice barely above a whisper despite the terror gripping my chest. "None of those doctors have ever evaluated me in person." The attorney leaned forward, invading my personal space. "The truth is irrelevant in a courtroom, Claire. What matters is the documentation. These physicians have impeccable credentials. They have reviewed the footage of your erratic behavior, your claims of surveillance, your refusal to accept medical care." He paused, letting the threat settle over the table. "If you do not sign the surgical proxy right now in front of these witnesses," he hissed, nodding toward his 2 associates, "I will make a single phone call. The police will arrive at this cafe within 5 minutes. They will not ask questions. They will see a pregnant woman exhibiting signs of severe mental distress backed by a fully authorized psychiatric hold order. They will place you in restraints, load you into an ambulance, and transport you to a secure facility." He slid a silver pen across the marble table. It rolled and stopped exactly in front of my hands. "You will spend the remainder of your pregnancy in a locked ward, heavily sedated." The attorney concluded, his eyes dead and unblinking. "Upon delivery, the state will automatically sever your maternal rights. Harrison will assume full custody. The cord blood will be harvested, and you will wake up in a padded room with absolutely nothing. The courts always listen to the party with the resources to fund the narrative. Sign the document." The trap was flawlessly executed. The public setting prevented me from running. The forged psychiatric evaluation provided the legal justification for immediate incarceration. The threat of losing my child was visceral and immediate. I needed to buy time. I needed 72 hours for Sarah to retrieve the DNA results from the independent laboratory. If I refused to sign, they would initiate the psychiatric hold, and I would lose all ability to execute my counterstrike at the baby shower. I had to surrender the battle to win the war. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I channeled every ounce of genuine terror and exhaustion into a masterful performance of total capitulation. "Please," I sobbed, letting the tears spill over my eyelashes and streak down my cheeks. My hands began to shake violently. I reached for the silver pen, fumbling with it clumsily, ensuring the attorneys and the surrounding patrons witnessed my complete physical and emotional breakdown. "Please, just do not take my baby away. I will do whatever he wants." I pulled the surgical proxy toward me. I gripped the pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. A compliance auditor knows that a contract is only as strong as its identifying data. A signature obtained under duress is legally voidable, but proving duress takes months of litigation. However, a contract executed with deliberately falsified identifying information triggers an automatic administrative hold within the hospital system during the verification process. I pressed the pen to the signature line. I did not sign my legal name. I used a rapid, jagged scrawl that loosely resembled my signature, but altered the structural loops and angles, ensuring a forensic handwriting analyst would easily identify the discrepancy later. More importantly, I moved to the section requiring my Social Security number and date of birth. I deliberately transposed the middle 2 digits of my SSN and altered my birth year by a single digit. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible error that a smug attorney gloating over a forced signature would likely overlook in his rush to claim victory. I finished signing the document and pushed it back across the table, my chest heaving with fake hysterical sobs. I buried my face in my hands, playing the role of the broken, defeated daughter to perfection. The lead attorney snapped the folder shut with a sharp, satisfying crack. He did not bother verifying the data. He had secured the signature. His job was complete. A wise decision, Claire, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He placed the folder back into his briefcase and stood up, signaling his associates to follow. Your father will be pleased. Ensure you maintain this cooperative attitude at the baby shower this weekend. The press does not respond well to hysterics. The three men turned and exited the cafe, blending seamlessly back into the flow of corporate traffic on the sidewalk outside. Sarah, who had remained silent and perfectly still during the entire exchange, handed me a paper napkin. She watched the attorneys disappear down the street before leaning in close. "Did you just sign away your surgical rights?" Sarah whispered, her tone laced with genuine alarm. "If that document enters the hospital system, Harrison can legally order them to induce labor tomorrow." I wiped the tears from my face. My posture straightened. The hysterical sobbing vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating calm that made Sarah blink in surprise. I signed a document containing a structurally compromised signature and a falsified Social Security number. I replied, my voice steady and precise. When Genesis Biolabs attempts to log that proxy into their central surgical registry, the automated identity verification system will flag the mismatched data. Protocol dictates a mandatory 72-hour administrative freeze while the legal department investigates the discrepancy to avoid massive federal liability for operating on an unverified patient profile. I looked at Sarah, a dangerous smile touching the corners of my mouth. I did not surrender my rights. I just initiated a bureaucratic firewall that buys us exactly 3 days. Sarah let out a slow, amazed breath. She shook her head, a small smile breaking through her professional facade. "You are a terrifying woman, Claire." I picked up my cold coffee. "Not terrifying," I corrected softly. "Audited." The legal ambush had failed. Harrison believed he had secured my submission through intimidation and forged psychiatric threats. He believed the surgical proxy was ironclad, clearing the path for the biological harvest. He was preparing to host a lavish baby shower to celebrate his total victory, confident that he controlled every variable in the room. He did not know that the contract sitting in his lawyer's briefcase was a ticking time bomb of invalid data. And he certainly did not know that in exactly 72 hours, the true nature of his perfect daughter's genetic lineage would detonate on his grand stage, reducing his carefully constructed empire to a pile of worthless ash. The countdown to the Kensington dynasty's destruction had officially begun. The night before the baby shower, the penthouse felt less like a prison and more like a blast radius waiting for ignition. I sat on the edge of the sterile white sofa, the glow of the city lights reflecting off the glass windows. My bag was packed, hidden beneath the bed frame. The invalid surgical proxy was slowly grinding its way through the Genesis Biolabs administrative firewall, exactly as I had calculated. Now everything hinged on the results Sarah had secured from the independent genomics laboratory in Chicago. At 11:45 p.m., the heavy steel door chimed. Sarah stepped inside, bypassing the daily security protocols. She did not wear her crisp blue scrubs. She wore a dark trench coat, her hair pulled back hastily. She locked the deadbolt and turned to face me. Her hands were visibly shaking. She pulled a sealed priority mail envelope from inside her coat. She did not hand it to me immediately. She stood in the center of the living room, staring at the paper as if it were a live grenade. I expedited the processing. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I bypassed the standard mail delivery and drove to the courier depot to intercept it an hour ago. Claire. I read the summary page. I stood up, crossing the room to take the envelope from her trembling hands. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the potential to destroy the Kensington Empire. I ripped open the seal and pulled out the crisp white laboratory report. As a healthcare compliance auditor, I was accustomed to reading dense genetic sequencing data. My eyes bypassed the introductory medical jargon and locked directly onto the comparative allele analysis, the specific genetic markers used to establish biological relationships. I read the first column. Sample A Harrison Kensington. Sample B Claire Kensington. The probability of paternity registered at 99.99%, a standard expected result. I moved to the second column. Sample A Harrison Kensington. Sample C Blair Kensington. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs, a sudden violent thud that echoed in the silent room. I read the numbers again, tracing my finger along the printed line to ensure my exhausted eyes were not deceiving me. The probability of paternity registered at 0.00%. The report detailed a complete absence of shared genetic markers between Harrison and Blair across multiple key loci. The chromosomal divergence was absolute. Blair is not Harrison's biological daughter. I stated the words hanging in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Diana engaged in an affair 28 years ago. She fabricated a paternity narrative and built an entire life upon a biological lie. Sarah nodded slowly, her arms wrapped around her torso. The genetic markers indicate Blair shares maternal DNA with you, confirming Diana is her mother. But the paternal alleles are completely foreign. Blair does not possess a single drop of Kensington blood. The sheer magnitude of the deception washed over me, a tidal wave of realization that recontextualized every single interaction, every cruelty, every moment of favoritism I had endured for 3 decades. Blair, the golden child, the perfect heir, the daughter who received the finest education, the most lavish praise, and the unwavering protection of the Kensington dynasty, was an imposter. I, the outcast, the scapegoat the daughter deemed an unworthy investment, was Harrison's sole biological heir. But the personal vindication paled in comparison to the catastrophic medical ramifications. Because Blair is only my half-sister, I whispered, my mind racing through the immunological consequences. The human leukocyte antigen typing is fundamentally incompatible. A successful bone marrow or stem cell transplant requires a closely matched HLA profile to prevent severe graft versus host disease. Full siblings have a 25% chance of a perfect match. Half-siblings rarely match closely enough to survive the procedure without fatal rejection complications. I looked up at Sarah, a cold, ruthless clarity settling over my features. The umbilical cord blood Harrison is so desperate to harvest from my child will not save Blair. It is biologically useless to her. The genetic mismatch is too vast. If Genesis Biolabs proceeds with the transplant using my child's stem cells, Blair's immune system will violently reject the graft. The procedure will kill her faster than the aplastic anemia. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Harrison is orchestrating a federal medical kidnapping. He is holding you hostage, forcing experimental chemicals into your veins, and preparing to forcibly induce labor, all to harvest a biological asset that will ultimately prove lethal to his favorite daughter. And he has absolutely no idea. Diana knows, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Diana knows Blair is not Harrison's child. She has known for 28 years. When Blair's bone marrow began failing, Diana must have realized that a comprehensive genetic screening would expose her affair. She panicked. She convinced Harrison to bypass the standard independent compatibility protocols and rush the procedure using his own private laboratory network, relying on the assumption that full sisters would eventually yield a viable match. She is risking my life, my child's life, and Blair's life entirely to protect her marriage and her social standing. The anger I had harbored for months, the fear, the isolation, all of it instantly crystallized into a singular razor-sharp weapon. Harrison was committing a litany of federal crimes to protect a legacy that did not exist. Diana was orchestrating a multi-layered biological fraud to conceal a decades-old betrayal. They had trapped me in a high-tech prison intending to strip me of my motherhood, believing they held absolute control over the narrative. They were wrong. They had built a towering fortress of deception, and they had unwittingly handed the detonator directly to the compliance auditor they despised. I did not feel fear anymore. I did not feel the lingering effects of the chemical sedatives. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of power. I held the genetic proof that would dismantle the Kensington dynasty, invalidate the medical justification for the kidnapping, and destroy the core foundation of my parents' marriage. I carefully folded the laboratory report and slipped it back into the envelope. I did not need to run. I did not need to hide. I needed a stage large enough to ensure that when the bomb dropped, the resulting shockwave would reach every corner of their elite social circle. Harrison wants a public spectacle tomorrow. I said, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of my mouth. He invited the press, the hospital executives, and the politicians to witness my submission at the baby shower. He spent $80,000 to construct a beautiful gilded arena. I turned to Sarah, my eyes burning with a fierce, unrelenting resolve. Let us give him exactly what he paid for. We are going to that baby shower, and we are going to burn this entire family to the ground. I did not share the genetic bombshell with Julian. The corporate defense attorney possessed a formidable intellect, but he remained tethered to the Kensington empire. If I revealed the truth about Blair's parentage, Julian might panic, alerting Harrison prematurely to mitigate his own professional liability. I needed Julian operational focused and legally armed, but I needed him operating strictly on a need-to-know basis. I picked up the burner phone Julian had smuggled to me on the terrace. I dialed his secure private number, bypassing the monitored lines of the firm. He answered on the second ring. Julian, I said, keeping my voice low and authoritative. I do not have time for a prolonged explanation. You must trust me implicitly. What is happening? Claire Julian asked, his tone laced with immediate sharp tension. Has Harrison accelerated the timeline? Did the psychiatric board execute the hold? The psychiatric ambush failed. I replied, stating the fact with cold precision. The surgical proxy is currently trapped in an administrative verification loop within the Genesis Biolabs server network. Harrison believes he holds the advantage, but his legal foundation is entirely compromised. I paused, allowing the gravity of my next words to settle. I need you to draft a federal restraining order, an emergency order of protection, covering myself and my unborn child. I need you to file it with the federal magistrate the moment the courts open tomorrow morning. Cite severe medical coercion, attempted involuntary psychiatric commitment, and unauthorized biological harvesting. Julian exhaled a sharp, disbelieving breath. Claire, a federal protective order requires substantial, irrefutable evidence of imminent harm. If a judge rejects the petition, Harrison will retaliate with overwhelming legal force. He will destroy your credibility permanently. I possess the evidence, Julian. I stated, my grip tightening on the small plastic phone. I hold documentation that unequivocally invalidates the entire medical justification for the stem cell harvest. I will deploy it tomorrow at the baby shower. I leaned closer to the receiver, injecting a dangerous, unyielding certainty into my voice. Prepare the filings. Have the federal marshals on standby. Tomorrow afternoon you will have a singular opportunity to sever your ties to the Kensington dynasty permanently. If you fail to act, you will be federally indicted as an accomplice to medical kidnapping. Choose your allegiance carefully. I terminated the call before Julian could respond, snapping the burner phone shut. The trap was set. Julian, driven by a powerful combination of moral revulsion and self-preservation, would file the injunctions. He would weaponize his legal expertise to protect himself, unwittingly constructing the legal fortress I needed to finalize my escape. Meanwhile, across the city, Harrison and Diana were busy constructing a very different kind of structure. The Kensington estate was currently undergoing a massive $80,000 transformation. They were not merely hosting a baby shower, they were orchestrating a grand theatrical production designed to sanitize a forthcoming atrocity. Harrison understood optics. He recognized that the sudden acquisition of his estranged daughter's infant might raise uncomfortable questions among his elite social circle. He needed a pristine public narrative. He invited the press. He invited the hospital board executives, the local politicians, and the major philanthropic donors. He intended to utilize the baby shower to publicly rebrand himself. He would play the role of the benevolent patriarch, the forgiving father welcoming home his troubled prodigal daughter. Diana would play the compassionate mother, showering me with expensive gifts and feigned affection. They planned to stage a series of photographs and curated interactions documenting my supposed integration back into the loving fold of the family. This meticulously crafted public relations campaign would serve as the ultimate defense against any future allegations of coercion. When the baby was born, and the state subsequently stripped me of my maternal rights due to the fabricated psychiatric evaluation, Harrison would present the baby shower footage as proof of his ongoing selfless support. The narrative would portray a tragic, mentally unstable mother and a heroic grandfather stepping in to save a vulnerable infant. They believed they were constructing an impenetrable shield of social validation. They believed the $80,000 spent on imported orchids, vintage champagne, and a 12-piece string quartet would buy them absolute immunity. They did not realize they were financing the construction of their own execution block. I spent the final hours in the penthouse meticulously organizing my documentation. I transferred the encrypted files from my laptop onto a secure, low-profile USB drive, carefully tucking it into the lining of my clutch purse. I packed a small, unassuming duffel bag with basic necessities, ensuring it remained hidden beneath the bed frame. The morning of the baby shower arrived cold and brilliantly clear. Sarah arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, carrying a garment bag containing a custom maternity dress Diana had selected. It was a pale, muted gray, a color explicitly chosen to make me appear washed out, compliant, and fragile against the vibrant, opulent backdrop of the party. Sarah helped me dress her movements efficient and silent. As she secured the zipper, she leaned in close. The courier confirmed delivery. Sarah whispered, her eyes tracking the doorway. The duplicate copy of the DNA report is securely lodged in the federal Dropbox. The authorities have the raw data. I nodded, adjusting the high collar of the gray dress. The final piece was in play. At noon, the heavy steel door of the penthouse chimed. The biometric lock disengaged for the last time. A private security detail escorted me down to the underground parking garage, ushering me into the back of a waiting black town car. I stared out the tinted windows as the car navigated the city streets, moving steadily toward the Kensington estate. I did not feel the paralyzing terror that had gripped me just a week prior. I felt a profound, predatory calm. Harrison and Diana had spent months treating me as a disposable biological asset, a secondary character in their grand elite drama. They had weaponized their wealth, their medical connections, and the legal system to strip me of my autonomy. They believed they held absolute control over the narrative. They were about to discover the catastrophic consequences of underestimating a compliance auditor with a secure USB drive and nothing left to lose. I was walking directly into the center of their glittering $80,000 arena, ready to pull the pin on a biological grenade that would incinerate the Kensington legacy forever. The Kensington Estate Ballroom was a masterpiece of manufactured elegance. Hundreds of imported white orchids spilled from crystal vases, perfuming the air with a cloying, heavy sweetness. A 12-piece string ensemble played classical arrangements softly in the background, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the calculated social performance. 150 guests mingled under the glow of massive chandeliers, their designer gowns and tailored suits creating a sea of wealth and influence. I stood in the center of the room, encased in the muted gray maternity dress Diana had selected. I was the prop. I was the prodigal daughter the wayward stray returned to the forgiving embrace of the dynasty. Harrison did not leave my side for the first hour. He gripped my upper arm, his fingers digging into my skin with bruising territorial force, guiding me from table to table. He utilized his booming, charismatic voice to present a meticulously crafted narrative of parental benevolence. "This is Claire," Harrison announced, stopping in front of a prominent state senator and his wife. He offered a practiced, forgiving smile, ignoring my rigid posture. "She has faced some unfortunate challenges recently, a few poor choices, but we are committed to helping her rebuild her life. Family always provides a safety net, regardless of past mistakes." The senator offered a polite, sympathetic nod, his eyes sweeping over my plain dress with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled disdain. "It is admirable, Harrison, truly a testament to your character." He turned his gaze to me. "You are very fortunate to have such a supportive father, Claire. Many young women in your position are left to navigate these difficulties alone." I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away from Harrison's crushing grip. I maintained a smooth, compliant smile, allowing the senator to believe his condescending assessment. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice steady and deferential. "I am learning exactly what my family is capable of providing." Harrison beamed, satisfied with my performance, and steered me toward a group of hospital board executives. The routine continued. Each introduction was a calculated strike against my dignity, a public branding designed to cement my status as the unstable dependent daughter. The guests whispered behind their champagne flutes, exchanging knowing glances. They accepted the narrative Harrison fed them without question, eager to align themselves with the billionaire philanthropist rather than the purportedly troubled single mother. Across the ballroom, seated on a plush velvet settee, Blair held court. She wore a stunning custom silk maternity dress, the fabric draping elegantly over a small, fabricated bump she utilized for sympathy during social events. Despite her failing bone marrow, Diana had ensured a team of makeup artists masked Blair's pallor, painting a vibrant, healthy flush onto her cheeks. Blair watched my forced march across the room with a triumphant, predatory smirk. She lifted her crystal glass of sparkling cider, offering a mock toast in my direction. Her eyes burned with entitled possession. She looked at my swollen stomach, not as a niece or a nephew, but as a guaranteed medical supply, drop a biological resource she had already claimed ownership of. The humiliation was designed to be suffocating. Every patronizing comment, every whispered insult, every triumphant glance from Blair was intended to break my spirit, to reinforce my complete powerlessness in the face of their overwhelming wealth and social capital. But the humiliation did not break me. It forged me into a weapon. I stood tall, my hand resting protectively over my child, enduring the psychological assault with the cold, absolute certainty of an executioner waiting for the drop. I scanned the perimeter of the ballroom, locating Julian. The corporate defense attorney stood near the exit doors, his posture stiff, his eyes darting nervously toward the main gates of the estate. He had filed the federal injunctions that morning. He knew the legal ambush was primed, but he remained unaware of the biological bomb I carried. I caught Sarah's eye. The private nurse stood near the catering station, blending seamlessly into the background as an unobtrusive medical attendant. I gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah moved with casual precision. She detached herself from the catering area and navigated toward the elevated staging platform at the front of the ballroom. A large, high-definition LED screen dominated the wall behind the podium, currently displaying a looping, soft-focus slideshow of generic, heartwarming baby photographs. Harrison had planned to pause the party and utilize the screen to broadcast a highly edited ultrasound video, further cementing the illusion of a joyous, anticipated arrival. Sarah reached the audio-visual control console positioned discreetly beside the stage. The technician monitoring the equipment had stepped away briefly to grab a fresh glass of water. It was a 10-second window. Sarah slipped a sleek black USB drive from her pocket. She quickly bypassed the standard media queue, inserted the drive into the primary port, and overrode the scheduled slideshow presentation, mapping the display output directly to the encrypted files I had compiled in the Penthouse. She stepped back from the console just as the technician returned, melting back into the crowd before anyone noticed her intervention. The trap was fully armed. Harrison released his bruising grip on my arm. He checked his gold Rolex, signaling that the time for mingling had concluded. He smoothed his lapels, projecting the aura of a man preparing to deliver a keynote address to his shareholders. "It is time, Claire," Harrison commanded, his voice dropping its jovial tone, reverting to the cold, authoritative register he used in private. "We will proceed to the stage. You will stand beside me. You will smile for the cameras. And when I conclude my remarks, you will sign the documents presented to you. Do not deviate from the script." I did not argue. I did not resist. I offered a final compliant nod. I followed him toward the podium, my steps measured and deliberate. The string quartet faded into silence. The low hum of conversation across the ballroom gradually ceased as the guests turned their attention toward the front of the room. 150 members of the elite social strata watched as Harrison Kensington claimed the spotlight, ready to finalize his masterpiece of public manipulation. He stepped up to the microphone, radiating absolute confidence. He believed he controlled the narrative. I believed he controlled my future. He did not know that the LED screen behind him was no longer loaded with a heartwarming ultrasound video. He did not know that the carefully curated stage was about to become the epicenter of his total catastrophic ruin. Harrison stepped up to the acrylic podium, tapping the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified sound sliced through the remaining murmurs in the ballroom, commanding absolute silence from the 150 assembled guests. He grasped his champagne flute, his posture expanding to project the benevolent authority he believed he wielded over every person in the room. I stood 2 steps behind him, perfectly framed by the cameras positioned along the side walls. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and dear friends," Harrison began, his voice booming through the high-end sound system. "We gather today to celebrate the expansion of the Kensington family. As many of you are aware, my eldest daughter Claire has faced a difficult journey. She strayed far from the values we hold dear, navigating a path fraught with poor decisions and unfortunate consequences." He paused, allowing the audience to absorb the carefully constructed narrative of my supposed failures. He turned slightly, aiming a gaze dripping with condescension directly at me. "But family requires forgiveness," Harrison continued, raising his flute higher. "Let us raise a toast to Claire. It takes a special kind of desperation for a stray dog to drag herself back to our doorstep, bringing nothing but a bastard child and a mountain of regret. But the Kensington family is known for our charity." A ripple of uncomfortable, sycophantic laughter moved through the crowd. The politicians chuckled. The hospital executives smiled politely. Diana, standing near the front row, offered a tight, satisfied smirk. Blair applauded her applause, sharp and mocking. The trap was fully sprung. He had delivered his insult, established his dominance, and secured the crowd's complicity. It was my turn. I did not wait for the laughter to subside. I stepped forward, moving with a sudden, fluid precision that shattered my previous posture of submission. Before Harrison could react, before his security team could register the shift in my demeanor, I reached out and ripped the microphone from his hand. The sudden screech of audio feedback pierced the room, silencing the laughter instantly. "You are entirely correct, Father," I stated, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, cold clear and devoid of a single tremor. "I am the stray dog who returned, but I brought a gift you never anticipated." Harrison froze, his arms, still raised, his expression caught somewhere between shock and mounting fury. "What are you doing, Claire?" he hissed, stepping toward me. I ignored him. I pulled a small wireless presentation remote from the pocket of my gray dress and pressed the central button. The massive LED screen behind us flickered. The soft focus slideshow of generic baby photographs vanished. The screen illuminated with a stark, blindingly bright document. It was not an ultrasound video. It was a formal, heavily redacted Federal Medical Compliance Audit Report. The header bore the official seal of the Department of Health and Human Services. The bottom displayed my electronic signature, verifying my credentials as an active federal auditor. The guests gasped, a collective sound of shock rippling through the elite crowd. The journalists in the room immediately raised their cameras, recognizing a shifting narrative. I gripped the microphone, projecting my voice across the silent, stunned ballroom. "The Kensington family did not welcome me home out of charity," I announced, enunciating every syllable with ruthless clarity. "They hunted me down because my unborn child represented a biological resource they intended to steal." Harrison lunged for the microphone, his face flushing a deep, violent red. "Cut the audio!" he roared, frantically signaling the technician at the soundboard. "Security, remove her from the stage." I stepped backward, evading his grasp, and kept talking, speaking faster and louder to override his commands. They locked me inside a biometric holding cell. They injected me with high-dose hematopoietic agents, without informed consent, to artificially stimulate stem cell production in my bone marrow. They utilized a corrupted network of private physicians to fabricate a psychiatric evaluation, diagnosing me with prenatal psychosis. Diana screamed from the front row, dropping her champagne flute. It shattered against the floor, mirroring the collapse of their pristine image. "Stop her! She is lying. She is delusional." I pressed the button on the remote again. The screen shifted to a new slide. It displayed a high-definition photograph of the unlabeled amber bottles stored in the Penthouse refrigerator, alongside the clinical intake forms bearing the Genesis Biolabs insignia. Their objective, I continued, my voice slicing through Harrison's shouting, was to use the forged psychiatric hold to have me committed the moment my water broke. They intended to strip me of my maternal rights, forcibly induce labor, and harvest my child's umbilical cord blood to treat Blair's aplastic anemia. The ballroom erupted into chaos. The polite, refined atmosphere disintegrated into shouts of disbelief and horrified murmurs. The hospital board executives stared at the screen, recognizing the severe federal violations detailed in the evidence. The state senator backed away from the front row, visibly distancing himself from the imploding scandal. Harrison stood center stage, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate terror. He had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, using his wealth to silence dissent and bury the truth. Now the truth was magnified on a 20-foot screen in front of the very people whose respect he craved. "You are insane," Harrison bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain. "Turn off that screen. She is experiencing a psychotic break. Do not listen to a word," this hysterical woman says. He turned toward the guests, attempting to salvage the wreckage of his reputation through sheer volume and denial. "She is paranoid. We tried to help her, and this is how she repays us. She needs immediate psychiatric intervention." He signaled wildly to his security detail, but the guards hesitated, unsure how to handle a highly public confrontation involving federal documentation and aggressive media presence. I stood my ground on the stage, the microphone gripped tightly in my hand. Harrison was screaming, flailing, attempting to rebuild the lie through intimidation. But he was fighting a battle he had already lost. He thought the audit report was the culmination of my revenge. He thought exposing the medical kidnapping was the final strike. He had absolutely no idea that the true executioner was already moving through the crowd, carrying a secret that would not just destroy his public image, but annihilate his entire existence. The public humiliation was merely the prologue. The biological execution was about to begin. Harrison abandoned his attempts to address the chaotic ballroom. His polished philanthropic persona dissolved, entirely replaced by the raw, brutal instincts of a cornered predator. The veins pulsed thick and dark against his neck. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He lunged toward me, his arm pulling back to strike, intending to physically silence me and wrench the microphone from my grasp in front of 150 horrified guests. He never completed the swing. Sarah moved with lightning speed, intercepting his trajectory. She did not yell. She did not shove him. She stepped directly into his path, positioning herself between his raised hand and my body. She grabbed the wrist of his raised arm, her grip surprisingly strong, forcing him to halt his momentum. Harrison glared at her, confusion warring with his escalating rage. "What are you doing?" he snarled, trying to shake off her hold. "Restrain her. You work for me." Sarah did not release his wrist. She leaned in close, bringing her face inches from his. She pulled the microphone slightly toward them, ensuring the audio pickup remained active. She did not shout. She whispered. But the amplification system projected every single razor-sharp syllable across the silent, breathless ballroom. "The independent genetic sequencing is complete, Harrison." Sarah whispered, her voice a low, lethal hum that sliced through the heavy air. "The results confirm a 0% probability of paternity. Blair does not share a single genetic marker with you." Harrison froze. The tension in his raised arm evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying paralysis. "She is not your daughter," Sarah continued, her whisper ringing through the high-end speakers like a death knell. "Your wife engaged in an affair 28 years ago. This means the umbilical cord blood you are attempting to harvest is biologically incompatible. It is completely useless for Blair's transplant." Harrison's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The color drained from his face at a staggering rate, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes, previously blazing with fury, widened into twin pools of absolute, uncomprehending terror. And Harrison Sarah added, delivering the final fatal blow. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently securing the perimeter of this estate. They possess the raw data, the audit trail, and the forged psychiatric evaluations. They are waiting outside the doors right now with a warrant for your arrest under the federal statutes for aggravated medical extortion and the attempted trafficking of human biological material." The microphone caught his sharp, jagged intake of breath. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the polite silence of an attentive audience. It was the paralyzed silence of a room witnessing a catastrophic execution. Harrison slowly turned his head. His movements were mechanical, disjointed, like a man moving through deep water. He looked past me, past Sarah, and locked his eyes on Diana, who was standing in the front row. Diana's meticulously crafted facade had shattered completely. She was trembling violently, her hands hovering near her mouth. The remains of her shattered champagne glass lay scattered across the marble floor at her feet. She stared back at Harrison, her eyes wide with undeniable guilt. She did not shake her head. She did not scream a denial. The truth was written in the stark, panicked lines of her face. A 30-year marriage built on a foundational lie, a legacy secured by deception, an elaborate, torturous kidnapping scheme orchestrated to save a daughter who did not even carry his name. Every pillar of Harrison Kensington's existence detonated in a single whispered sentence. The realization hit him with physical force. Harrison's knees buckled. He did not brace himself. He simply collapsed, hitting the polished wooden stage with a heavy, hollow thud. He remained on his knees, his hands resting limply against his thighs, staring blankly ahead. He was breathing in short, rapid gasps, his chest heaving irregularly, but he remained entirely mute. The billionaire patriarch, the man who controlled politicians, dictated medical policy, and treated his own children as disposable assets, was reduced to a broken, hyperventilating shell in the center of his own $80,000 arena. The elite crowd watched the collapse in stunned fascination. The state senator turned his back and walked swiftly toward the side exit, signaling his security detail to clear a path. The hospital board executives huddled together, their faces grim, already formulating strategies to distance their institutions from the impending federal indictment. Blair sat frozen on the velvet settee, her pale hands clutching her stomach. The color had fled from her artificially flushed cheeks. She stared at Diana, then at Harrison, her mind struggling to process the annihilation of her identity. The golden child, the perfect heir, had just been publicly stripped of her Kensington bloodline. She was an imposter, and the biological cure she had demanded was suddenly permanently out of reach. I stood above Harrison, watching him struggle to breathe. I did not feel pity. I did not feel the lingering sting of his insults. I felt nothing but a clean, cold finality. The trap had closed. The empire was in ruins. But the execution was not quite complete. One final participant remained on the board, and his move would finalize the destruction of the Kensington dynasty before the federal agents breached the doors. The paralyzing silence broke with a sudden piercing shriek. Blair lurched forward on the velvet settee, her composure shattering completely. The carefully applied makeup could not hide the sheer panic contorting her features. Julian Blair screamed, her voice cracking, as she frantically gestured toward the stage where Harrison knelt broken and gasping. "Do something. You are our lawyer. Protect my parents. Fix this right now." Julian stood near the exit doors, his posture rigid. He did not rush forward to shield his father-in-law. He did not pull out his phone to contact a crisis management team. He simply stared at Blair, his dark eyes stripped of any remaining affection or loyalty. He slowly unbuttoned his tailored Italian suit jacket. He walked down the center aisle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The remaining guests parted for him, sensing the imminent collision. Julian climbed the short steps to the stage, bypassing Diana's trembling form and ignoring Blair's hysterical demands. He stopped directly in front of Harrison. He pulled off his suit jacket and threw it down. The heavy fabric landed directly across Harrison's shoulders, a dismissive gesture dripping with absolute contempt. "I do not protect individuals who attempt to traffic human biological material," Julian stated. His deep baritone voice did not need a microphone to command the room. Blair gasped, clutching her chest as if physically struck. "Julian, what are you saying? You work for us." Julian turned his back on Harrison and looked directly at his wife. "I worked for a legitimate real estate holding company, Blair. I did not sign up to facilitate a medical black site, and I refuse to be complicit in the forced harvest of an unborn child." He reached into his shirt pocket and extracted a folded, thick legal document bearing the raised seal of a federal magistrate. Operating as Claire's independent legal counsel, Julian announced, his voice carrying the lethal authority of a seasoned corporate litigator. "I filed an emergency federal order of protection this morning. The injunction explicitly prohibits Harrison and Diana Kensington, along with any affiliated medical personnel, from coming within 500 feet of Claire or her infant." He tossed the injunction onto the stage floor next to Harrison's knees, and Blair Julian added, his tone dropping to a cold, finalized register. "My legal associates are currently drafting the divorce dissolution papers. The courier will deliver them to whatever facility houses you tomorrow morning. We are finished." Blair collapsed back onto the settee, burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing loudly in the tense air. The golden child was entirely isolated, stripped of her bloodline, her marriage, and her medical salvation in less than 5 minutes. The ballroom erupted into sheer pandemonium. The facade of high society decorum evaporated. Guests scrambled toward the exits, abandoning expensive coats and designer clutches in their frantic haste to escape the blast radius of the scandal. The string quartet players grabbed their instruments and fled through the catering doors. Then, the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance burst open with explosive force. Federal agents clad in dark tactical windbreakers flooded into the ballroom, flanked by armed officers from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. The harsh, aggressive clatter of tactical boots hitting the marble floor drowned out the screams of the fleeing guests. Harrison Kensington, a senior federal agent, barked, cutting through the chaos. He marched directly toward the stage, unholstering a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest for severe violations of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, aggravated medical extortion, and conspiracy to commit forced biological harvesting." 2 agents flanked Harrison, hauling him roughly to his feet. He offered zero resistance. The billionaire tycoon hung limp between them, his eyes glassy and unfocused, completely unresponsive as the cold steel clamped around his wrists. Diana threw herself forward, her silver mink coat slipping from her shoulders. She scrambled toward the stage, tears streaming down her face, her carefully styled hair falling in messy strands across her eyes. Claire Diana shrieked, reaching out with manic desperation. She grabbed the hem of my gray maternity dress, her fingernails digging into the fabric. "Claire, please, tell them it is a misunderstanding. You cannot let them do this. I am your mother." I looked down at her. I saw the woman who had locked me in a penthouse, starved me, and plotted to cut my child out of my body to hide her own infidelity. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my dress. "You stopped being my mother the moment you looked at my child and saw nothing but spare parts." I said quietly, the finality in my voice absolute. A female federal agent stepped in immediately, grabbing Diana by the arms and hauling her backward. "Ma'am, step away from the victim," the agent commanded sternly, securing a grip on Diana's shoulders and steering her away from the stage. The ballroom descended into an aggressive symphony of law enforcement activity. Agents secured the perimeter, detaining the private security team and questioning the remaining event staff. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the manicured driveway of the Kensington estate was bathed in the harsh, rhythmic flashing of red and blue police lights, illuminating the pristine white orchids in a violent, chaotic strobe. Julian stood beside me, his hands resting on his hips, watching the agents escort Harrison and Diana out the main doors. He let out a long, ragged exhale, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. "It is over," Julian said softly. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling a strong, reassuring kick against my ribs. I looked at the shattered champagne glass on the floor, the discarded suit jacket, and the empty gilded chairs. "Yes," I replied, a small, genuine smile breaking across my face for the first time in months. "It is finally over." 2 months passed since the crystal champagne flute shattered on the marble floor of the Kensington estate. The Federal Detention Center in upstate New York offers no sweeping skyline views, no imported orchids, and no private security details. Harrison resides in an 8x10 concrete cell awaiting trial without the option of bail. The prosecuting attorneys categorized him as a severe flight risk, presenting the judge with a mountain of intercepted bank transfers and encrypted flight logs, indicating he intended to flee the jurisdiction. I did not visit him. I read the indictment documents Julian forwarded to my secure inbox. The charges read like a masterclass in corporate and biological corruption, medical extortion, wire fraud, conspiracy to violate federal organ trafficking statutes. The Department of Justice froze his medical real estate empire within 48 hours of the baby shower. The corporate board, he spent decades ruling with an iron fist, voted to oust him. The very next morning, cooperating fully with the federal investigators to save their own lucrative careers. His pristine legacy dissolved into a cautionary tale taught in legal ethics seminars across the country. Diana faces a different kind of imprisonment. The financial freeze swept up her joint accounts. The resulting civil litigation from defrauded investors drained whatever personal wealth she managed to hide in offshore trusts. But her true punishment manifested in the elite social circles she once commanded. High society operates on a strict currency of reputation, and Diana lost all her capital overnight. The country clubs revoked her memberships via sterile automated emails. The philanthropic boards erased her name from their letterheads, desperate to distance their charities from the unfolding biological scandal. The women who drank her vintage champagne at the estate now cross the street to avoid acknowledging her presence. She currently rents a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, selling off her remaining designer handbags and diamond earrings to afford basic legal representation. The 30-year facade of the perfect matriarch collapsed, leaving behind a woman isolated by her own toxic vanity and a devastating public revelation of infidelity. Blair experienced the harshest collision with reality. The divorce proceedings orchestrated by Julian were swift, surgical, and merciless. He drafted a settlement that left her with zero claim to his corporate earnings, citing explicit breach of marital trust and her direct involvement in the conspiracy to commit medical harm. She walked away from the marriage with a single suitcase stripped of the luxury she believed was her birthright. Without Harrison funding an illicit medical network to secure a forced biological donor, she faced the exact same medical reality as every other citizen. She sits in the sterile, crowded waiting rooms of public oncology clinics, holding a standard numbered ticket waiting hours just to speak with a resident physician. She registered on the National Bone Marrow Donor waiting list, hoping for an anonymous match. The golden child who once demanded a human life as tribute must now rely on the genuine voluntary charity of strangers to survive. My own life took a drastically different trajectory. I gave birth to a healthy, vibrant baby girl on a crisp Tuesday morning. I chose a quiet, reputable hospital in a neighboring state, a facility holding zero ties to the Kensington network or their corrupted payroll. The delivery room did not feature biometric locks or unlabeled chemical syringes. It featured warm sunlight, soft blankets, and the steady, reassuring hum of a standard fetal monitor. I did not labor under the threat of a surgical ambush. I brought my daughter into the world surrounded by an atmosphere of calm, unwavering support. I named her Maya. She carries my first name as her legal surname. The Kensington title ends with me. I refuse to attach that legacy of exploitation to her future. Julian stood in the waiting room during the delivery. He held a bouquet of yellow tulips and a stack of legal documents, finalizing the permanent restraining orders against my parents. He transitioned from a reluctant corporate operative into an exceptional godfather. He visits every weekend, bringing obscure legal textbooks to read aloud to Maya, claiming it will sharpen her vocabulary early on. He found his moral compass the night he threw his suit jacket at Harrison, and he never compromised it again. Sarah transitioned from my hired warden into my closest confidant. She secured a prominent position as a nursing director at a rival hospital system, utilizing her impeccable credentials and newly unburdened conscience. She acts as an honorary aunt to Maya, offering expert pediatric advice and fierce protective loyalty. We share dinners on Friday nights, laughing in a kitchen that holds no hidden surveillance cameras and no locked doors. The bond forged in that high-rise prison solidified into a lifelong sisterhood. The transition from a hunted compliance auditor to a secure, independent mother required time. I spent the first few weeks waking up at the slightest noise, my instincts still primed for a sudden ambush. Every unexpected knock at the door sent a spike of adrenaline through my veins. But as the federal indictments piled up against Harrison and the restraining orders took permanent effect, the hypervigilance slowly faded. The millions of dollars Harrison used to isolate and terrorize me proved futile against a verified audit trail and a unified front of whistleblowers. The law, when presented with undeniable forensic evidence, operated exactly as designed. Tonight I stand in the doorway of the nursery. The walls are painted a soft, soothing sage green. The moonlight spills across the wooden floorboards, illuminating the quiet, peaceful space. Maya sleeps soundly in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. She knows nothing of the genetic deception, the biometric locks, or the high-stakes legal warfare that preceded her arrival. She only knows the warmth of a safe home and the unconditional presence of a mother who fought a billionaire empire to secure her freedom. Looking at her, the final, most profound lesson crystallizes in my mind. Society often weaponizes the concept of family demanding endless loyalty in exchange for shared DNA. We are conditioned to believe that bloodlines dictate our obligations, that we owe our parents obedience simply because they provided our genetics. My parents attempted to exploit that conditioning. They viewed my body as a biological resource, my child as a spare part, and my life as a debt I owed them for the mere act of existing. They were wrong. Your physical autonomy is not a bargaining chip. Your children are not raw materials waiting for harvest. Your existence is not a loan requiring repayment to the people who supplied your genetics. Blood provides a biological starting point, but it does not forge a family. Respect, mutual protection, and unconditional support forge a family. I did not need a billionaire father to provide a roof over my head. I did not need an aristocratic mother to validate my worth. I built my own sanctuary using the precise analytical skills they mocked and underestimated. I surrounded myself with a chosen family who defends me without asking for a pound of flesh in return. Harrison Kensington stood on a stage and called me a stray dog. He believed his wealth granted him the authority to define my identity and dictate my future. He learned the hard way that an auditor does not beg for a place at the table. An auditor inspects the foundation, identifies the rot, and brings the entire compromised structure crashing down. No one, regardless of their net worth or social standing, holds the right to call you a stray when you possess the strength to build a kingdom of your own. Surviving the Kensington dynasty taught me profound truths that no corporate compliance manual ever could. The first lesson is that your physical autonomy is non-negotiable. Society frequently weaponizes guilt, conditioning us to believe we owe our parents unquestioning obedience simply because we share their DNA. But your body is not a biological resource, and your children are not spare parts waiting for a clinical harvest. You never owe your life as repayment to the people who supplied your genetics. Setting an ironclad boundary against medical or emotional exploitation is not an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. The second lesson is that bloodlines do not forge a family. A shared last name means nothing if it operates as a leash designed to drag you into a cage. True family is found in the individuals who choose to stand between you and the fire. It is found in a corporate defense lawyer who risks his prestigious career to hand you an escape route, and a private nurse who risks her medical license to secure the forensic evidence you need to fight back. Respect, mutual protection, and unconditional support dictate who belongs at your table. Everyone else is merely a biological coincidence. The final lesson centers on the true nature of power. Harrison believed his immense wealth, his private network, and his societal status granted him the unyielding authority to rewrite reality. He assumed endless intimidation could overwrite empirical facts. But intimidation shatters when confronted with irrefutable documented truth. You do not need a billion-dollar real estate empire to dismantle a corrupt, abusive system. You only need the courage to collect the evidence, the patience to wait for the perfect moment, and the cold precision to strike where the structural foundation is weakest. I did not crawl back to the Kensington estate as a defeated stray dog. I walked onto their grand stage, struck a match, and burned their gilded prison to the ground, securing my permanent freedom in the resulting ashes. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and sanity? How did you enforce your boundaries when tested? Drop your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you for listening to my story here on Olivia Stories Revenge. Never let anyone dictate your worth.